In the early 1950s, the CIA launched a covert program known as MKUltra, aiming to develop mind control techniques through chemical and psychological means, often without the consent of its subjects. Bluebook Case File 86001, partially declassified. This is the Bluebook Division, broadcasting from a basement office where the shadows of Cold War secrets still linger. The file before me concerns MKUltra, the CIA's clandestine mind control program that inspired elements of Stranger Things. The investigation traces the program's origins, its methods, and the aftermath of a controversial era in psychological warfare. MKUltra emerged in 1953, a product of mounting Cold War anxiety. The United States intelligence community viewed the human mind as a new battlefield, fearing that Soviet and Chinese adversaries had developed advanced techniques for psychological manipulation and brainwashing. The CIA's goal was to develop its own arsenal of methods, both for interrogation and for potential control of behavior. The agency drew on earlier efforts from World War II, including experiments with so-called truth serums and hypnosis. But MKUltra aimed to push far beyond. Chemical agents like LSD, barbiturates, and amphetamines were central to its approach. The program was cloaked in secrecy, with layers of compartmentalization so that even participating scientists and contractors often had no idea they were serving the CIA. This deliberate obfuscation shielded the agency from oversight and accountability. Early experiments sought substances that could weaken resistance to interrogation. Sensory deprivation and hypnosis featured prominently, as investigators looked for ways to dismantle psychological defenses. Ultimately, MKUltra's inception reflected a wider Cold War mindset. The threat was not just on foreign soil, but within the human mind itself. Control, not merely persuasion, was the objective. The techniques tested under MKUltra were wide-ranging and often extreme. LSD became the program's signature substance, administered to subjects without their knowledge or consent. Test populations included hospital patients, military personnel, prisoners, and civilians, many completely unaware of their involvement. Sensory deprivation tanks were another favored tool. Subjects submerged in darkness and silence, often under the influence of psychoactive drugs, became disoriented and vulnerable to suggestion. The aim was to disrupt normal cognitive processes and strip away psychological resistance. Hypnosis was also explored, sometimes in combination with drugs to implant ideas or extract information. Results were inconsistent, and the science behind these efforts was questionable even by the standards of the time. Yet the pursuit continued. Psychological torture methods, sleep deprivation, forced isolation, manipulation of basic needs, were employed to further break down mental barriers. The program's reach extended to other drugs beyond LSD, such as barbiturates and amphetamines. These were sometimes administered together in the hope of developing a so-called truth serum or inducing amnesia. Many subjects suffered lasting psychological effects, and some never recovered. The methods employed by MKUltra would later be cited as clear violations of ethical norms. The human cost of MKUltra was significant, though the full extent remains unknown. Victims included the mentally ill, prisoners, military volunteers, and ordinary citizens who found themselves unwitting subjects. Many were chosen because they were vulnerable, psychiatric patients, marginalized groups, or people with little power to refuse. In most cases, consent was neither sought nor given. The secrecy surrounding the program ensured that victims had no understanding of what was being done to them, nor any avenue for recourse. Some suffered long-term psychological harm, and documented cases include suicides linked to the trauma of participation. The destruction of most MKUltra files in 1973, under order of then CIA Director Richard Helms, erased many details. This act obscured the true scope of abuse and left countless victims unidentified. Survivor testimonies and accounts from whistleblowers have revealed a pattern of systemic disregard for human rights and dignity. Even decades later, the names and stories of many who suffered remain lost to history, with only fragments of documentation to suggest the scale of the harm. MKUltra remained secret for over 2 decades. Its existence came to light in the mid-1970s, amid a broader reckoning with intelligence agency abuses. The Senate's Church Committee hearings, alongside investigations by the Rockefeller Commission, exposed the program's existence and some of its methods. Declassified documents revealed that the CIA had conducted hundreds of experiments, many without informed consent. The destruction of most records limited the scope of what could be proven, but what remained was enough to provoke widespread outrage. Public reaction ranged from disbelief to horror at the notion of government-sanctioned mind control experiments. Trust in institutions was shaken. Reforms followed, new regulations on human experimentation, increased oversight of intelligence agencies. But the questions that remained unanswered were as troubling as the answers that had been found. MKUltra's shadow reaches far beyond the agency files. It became a cultural touchstone, a symbol of Cold War paranoia and government overreach that has shaped fiction, film, and public consciousness for decades. Stranger Things draws directly on this legacy. The psychic experiments, the sensory deprivation, the shadowy government facility, these are not inventions. They are reflections. The show's creators have acknowledged the real-world roots of Eleven's story. A child subjected to experiments she did not choose, in a facility she could not leave, by people who viewed her as a resource rather than a person. That is not science fiction. That is MKUltra. Front organizations were central to how MKUltra operated without scrutiny. The CIA funneled funding through research foundations, academic institutions, and hospitals, many of which had no idea who was ultimately paying the bills. The Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology, the Geschichter Fund for Medical Research, legitimate-sounding names concealing classified objectives. At least 80 institutions participated. Most of their researchers never knew they were working for American intelligence. This layer of separation was deliberate. It provided deniability and made the program almost impossible to trace. Understanding MKUltra today is complicated by what was deliberately destroyed. In 1973, CIA Director Richard Helms ordered the bulk of MKUltra's records shredded. The order came just as congressional investigators were beginning to ask questions. What survived did so largely by accident, financial records stored in a separate location, overlooked in the purge. It was these documents, discovered in 1977, that finally gave investigators something solid to work with. But they represent a fraction of what existed. The full scope of what was done, the number of subjects, the range of experiments, the outcomes will likely never be known. What remains is a case file that cannot be fully closed. The experiments were real, the harm was real, the deliberate concealment was real, and the institutional structures that made it possible, the compartmentalization, the use of intermediaries, the classified designation that placed it beyond normal oversight, those structures were not unique to MKUltra. They were features of the intelligence apparatus, not bugs. The reforms that followed were meaningful. But reform is not the same as resolution. Some of those who were subjected to these programs are still alive. Most never received acknowledgement. Many never knew what had been done to them. The case file remains open. Further material will be declassified in due course. Channel 86, out.